Welcome to our channel, Check Globe. Today we will talk about climate change and biodiversity and sustainable practices of different countries. Let's get started. When you look at the emission of a country in total, let's say, for example, Germany and China have similar emissions, but then you should also consider per capita emissions. And there comes quite a big difference.
Absolutely, there really does. And I think that when you look, for example, at a country the size of China, the per capita emissions are very low. And the vast majority of people in China, for example, living in rural areas or living in poverty, themselves, it's just madness to suggest that they have any responsibility over climate change, really. They're just doing what they can do to survive. And to then hear sort of Europe say, oh, well, why should we be doing anything? It's the emissions are being produced here. That bothers me quite a lot.
And when we're talking about climate change, quite often also the topic of biodiversity is brought up.
So the two problems of climate change and biodiversity loss are very strongly linked. What we do know is that climate change drives biodiversity loss. So as temperatures rise, then species have to migrate or they die out. And so we can see, for example, just this week, we've been told that the Amazon rainforest is at a tipping point. If we don't take action very soon to properly protect the Amazon rainforest, it will not be a rainforest very soon. It will just die out and become tundra, like grasslands, a more desertified system. And that has a huge impact on biodiversity. I mean, that is one of the world's global hotspots of biodiversity. And if it doesn't exist, we lose countless species of plants and animals. Things we don't even know exist yet will be gone, which is quite devastating news, really. Quite a shock. And it's driven, of course, it's driven by deforestation and destruction within the Amazon. But it's also about this change in temperatures in climate that make it a viable ecosystem. We can see, again, the same IPCC report has really spelled out that this is happening and faster than we thought that it was ever going to. It's now accelerated the impact of biodiversity loss. So there's a direct link there. We also know that there are lots of things that we can do as a society that are beneficial to both biodiversity and to climate. So, for example, planting green space, improving semi-natural vegetation in agricultural landscapes, for example, that's of benefit to both biodiversity and to climate because it can help with sequestering carbon, so mitigating climate change, and it can help us to adapt to climate change, for example, by producing cooling effects of shade and keeping water in the landscape. So in that way, they're linked. But to me, they're also fundamentally linked in that if you zoom out, these climate change and biodiversity loss are essentially symptoms of the same problem of overconsumption, of the way that we live as a society. When I was talking about consumption being at the heart of climate change, our consumption patterns and the way that we want more and more things, that's also at the heart of what's driving biodiversity loss. It's shifted our relationship with nature. So nature has become expendable because we want goods and services. And so we're chopping down trees, we're intensifying our agricultural production and losing biodiversity because we want to eat in a certain way, because we want certain materials, and we want to produce those on the land that we have available. Same processes that drive climate change are driving biodiversity loss. And to me, it doesn't make sense to really see them as separate problems. They're both impacts of this same problem. And that is fundamentally about our relationship as a society with nature and the way that we exploit and consume it.
When we're talking about different states and things they're doing for climate change, do you have any examples of states which were really good on being more sustainable recently?
I think there are different countries that do different things well. But I think that we have to keep in mind that I don't think there is an example of a country that is sustainable in all areas. When we talk in Europe about sustainability, I think there's a tendency to look to, for example, the Nordic states, so Norway and Sweden, for example, as being really sustainable and doing things well, particularly Norway with sort of electric car subsidies, lots of forestry happening there, and the sort of idea that they don't have much industry left within Norway itself, and so it's doing lots of sustainable things. But I think that that's a really questionable narrative, because actually a country like Norway has a lot of fossil fuel wealth. And so we have to ask, again, if we're talking about historical emissions, well, how is it that Norway is a rich country right now that can afford to give subsidies for things like electric cars? And that's because of its oil wealth and the way that it's extracting oil and releasing emissions beyond its own borders. And so when we talk about countries that are sustainable, we can look at what it's doing within its own borders as a country, but that's quite often greenwashing if you don't look at the impacts that are happening beyond its borders. And that can be through things like the industries that it has outside of Norway, for example, but it can also be about the emissions that are embedded in the things that people in that country are buying and consuming, and the way that it's living. I think that we also have to question some of the measures that people are taking to be sustainable. So, for example, if we're talking about Europe and this emphasis on electromobility, that there's a lot of conversations about this around the idea that, okay, we all need to shift from traditional fossil-fueled cars to electric cars in order to be sustainable. And I really would question that idea that actually shifting to electromobility is sustainable. Yes, we can say that there are lower carbon dioxide emissions associated with that. But where are we getting the materials for these batteries, for example? And we're mining them. And where are we mining them? We're mining them in the global south predominantly. And that has deforestation impacts, it has social impacts, and it has pollution impacts from the chemicals that we use to extract these materials and getting into the waterways and getting into the ecosystems, and it has health impacts on the people living there. So countries that currently have a narrative that they're more sustainable, that they've shifted away from sort of environmentally unsustainable actions, generally tend to be those that are closing their eyes to the impacts that they're having beyond their borders. So I don't think that there are currently sustainable countries at all. And until we think about this in a globalized way and start matching the global impacts to where the demand is and to the behaviours that are driving those global impacts, then we're not going to solve climate change. It's a global problem. We need to think joined up about this.
I guess everybody has to accept the responsibility for their own actions and don't close their eyes on the things that's happening